All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on reducing liability through lab decommissioning. My name is Sasha and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what today's webinar is going to entail, as well as a short introduction for our speaker today. Today's webinar will start with a slideshow presentation by our in-house expert, Craig Sassy. He'll be discussing a variety of topics with you, all related to liability reduction through lab decommissioning. The webinar will teach you what factors to look out for when considering your liability as it applies to a decommissioning, as well as best practices and the steps you need to take to assure your organization is protected. At the end of the presentation, there will be an open Q&A. You can ask questions by typing them into your chat pane on the right where it says Questions. All unanswered questions will be answered and sent out in an email after the presentation. In addition to the questions, all attendees will receive a recording of the presentation and a copy of the decks used. Today's speaker, Craig Sassy, has been employed at Triumvirate for over 6 years and has worked as an environmental consultant for over 18 years. He currently specializes in performing environmental consulting and engineering services to assess, manage, and mitigate environmental liability. Sassy has led a number of decommissioning projects here at Triumvirate. And with that, over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Sasha. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. What we hope to provide you is some information on the thoughtful decommissioning and the management of issues and liabilities associated with decommissioning and changes in lab space. This presentation isn't intended to be sufficient for every lab space, but begins to discuss many common issues and helps provide a starting point for making sure everything goes smoothly and you're managing many of the issues that are customarily encountered through these decommissionings. I'd like to first start with a quick poll, a question, and determine how many of you have an upcoming or a plan for laboratory move, closure, or renovation. Obviously, this is intended to assist those people, and we'll see how many of you have plans for that. We'll take a few moments to get some responses. Hoping that the presentation is able to provide you a good starting point for considering many of those issues that you will see at your particular space. So,
All right, Craig, you're all set. Yep.
Okay, we've got our poll results, and looks like there are several of you that have some coming up, and looking forward, like to provide you some of the information that we're looking for you to learn and take away, and start to begin the planning process for changes in your lab. Begin with questions and information that are customary to guide a good decommissioning. Try and answer the question, how clean is clean? That's many times very amorphous. And what other people and other organizations and businesses are conducting and managing on their expectations for cleaning facilities and leaving facilities and spaces. This information is helpful in managing relocations, internal moves, either by researchers or changes in processes within your labs, renovations of lab space, updates, equipment modifications, closures of lab space, and a discussion on owned versus non-owned or leased space and different drivers associated with occupancy and use of those areas. Where to start? Generally, the first is the schedule and logistics, and once you start delving into some of those issues, you commonly encounter and start expanding on issues specific to your facility, and those will come pretty quickly. Usually it starts with some measure of due diligence, understanding what's in your facility, starting to clear out unused old chemicals and equipment, removing those materials which don't need to be moved again or you're not looking to manage further. Start thinking about stopping research and the impacts for researchers there, and thinking about who else is going to be involved, movers, riggers, other vendors necessary to execute the decommissioning. And there's typically an assessment, sometimes remediation of contamination, assuring and assessing for any remaining issues and concerns, and finalizing your closure of your facility, making sure that there's no remaining issues. Many times there's other issues that are not particular to the lab space, but may have other obligations. Sometimes there's restoration provisions and other obligations that are not directly related, but may have an impact. And then the conclusion is a decommissioning report. These are generally the workflow that we see throughout these processes. In the initial stages, we look to try and identify all the stakeholders and make sure that those people are engaged early on. Internally, you may want to talk to lead researchers, your facilities group, finance, EH&S. Look at your own organization and see who needs to be engaged and start to get their input on the process. Externally, typically it's a landlord or a property manager that may need to be engaged, and it's important to understand your relationship with the organization's relationship with the landlord. A good relationship, it could make things pretty easy. If it's somewhat contentious, it could be a lot of back and forth on details, and just having some foreknowledge can help you manage those issues. Again, the obligations in the lease agreement, that's the backstop for many of these decommissionings, and many times internally there's obligations within the organization for some level of due diligence and assessment and documentation of clean conditions, and making sure you're achieving all those obligations. Obviously, you have to have your financing in order and start to look at some of the costs and start thinking about vendors and engaging, scoping activities, and pull together some of those costs. Information regarding your particular lab. Start gathering your information, maybe chemical inventories, equipment inventories, new facilities. If you're moving, where are things going to land? Those are always areas that wind up expanding quite a bit throughout the process. Start thinking about coordinating the end of research and activities in your lab space. Where's equipment going to reside? What needs to be calibrated and drained and managed by particular vendors, or some of your equipment may be leased, may have to go back. Research materials, storage needs. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that may be within cold storage, and you don't want to wind up not having a place for those materials to land. And there's many times transportation needs that need to be addressed, managing those materials. Overall logistics, how are things going to flow? Do you have a home for everything? Are vendors readily available? Where do you see issues? And it can help you focus on where you need help. Ultimately, the vacancy of the space. What's your end date? When's the last day you have? And with those in mind, it helps with that schedule development. Start thinking about your licensing. What licenses and permits are you obligated to manage? Either terminate, modify. Many times there's lead times. For instance, radioactive materials have quite a bit of a lead time, 45 days, or many times it's even more than that, to have all your data available for the regulators to review. Many times there's issues with lease obligations and in institutional risk and management. Many hurdles are out there. Lease obligations are typically vague. Sometimes it can be as little as broom clean. Other times it's more specific, but still amorphous, with certification by a certified industrial hygienist. It doesn't really define what certification has to state. There's no set regulatory agency or strong guidance from any agency on how these areas need to be left, or how to document how clean is clean. Once you leave a space, there could be some uncertainty if it's clean, and that will lead to concern, obviously. Claims by landlords or property managers about vacating space, whether it's clean or not clean, and could lead to costly and drawn-out discussions and decontamination that may not be necessary. Many times there's unexpected costs if you're not attentive. Waste that was unanticipated, either by discovery of old chemicals that were squirreled away by a researcher, or contamination that was unexpected, or sometimes it's as simple as debris management. Materials that aren't hazardous or aren't generated as part of the decontamination procedure, but were left behind. Just unwanted, sometimes new articles that were disposable in nature, and no one wanted to move it, and now it's in the way and has to be removed. The chemicals that may remain on surfaces always present the most problematic issue. You have the infrastructure of the building, which presents many problems and difficulties with appropriate assessment and decontamination when necessary. That leads to concerns with contractors or workers being exposed to chemicals in those lab spaces, and there's obviously some liability associated with that, and you want obviously to avoid that. When you're thinking about your space, is there a history of poor housekeeping, or unknown or poorly documented previous work, previous tenants that may have conducted activities there that may be still lingering? Those issues are always present the potential to be discovered during your closure activities. What is out there to help the decommissioning is a standard. It's a guidance document, but not from any regulatory agency. It's common in the industry and has been embraced to provide some framework for the process of performing laboratory decommissionings. The benefits are it's scalable. It can be applied to one room, or it can be applied to biologic materials management, all the way through radioactive material management, and can be implemented throughout the entire process, from planning through the decontamination reporting and decommissioning reporting. Presents some clear methods for documentation and verifying by establishing and characterizing an acceptable level of risk and making sure that it's documented and stated that that level of risk has been achieved. The decommissioning process is generally described as involving due diligence, an element of decommissioning, and then final documentation. In the initial phases of the due diligence, you're looking for knowledgeable people for interviews and sometimes institutional knowledge that may not be on paper readily available. Starting to gather information about your permits and licenses, materials, inventories, plans for your facility, and diagrams, gathering information that would be required to be able to guide the appropriate assessment and decommissioning of the space. During the more active portion, where you have equipment being removed and materials being managed appropriately and assessment and decommissioning, you'd want to define areas that require assessment where chemicals were used. It's generally not necessary to go into office personnel areas or common areas, restricting or clearly delineating your spaces that require assessment as a starting point. Establishing what equipment requires decontamination, what equipment is going to be removed from the space, noting what surfaces need to be decontaminated, understanding your infrastructure, and understanding how fluids are managed, either your wastewater system, your wastewater treatment equipment, or your local exhaust equipment, and understanding what means and methods are going to be utilized to establish clean conditions. Throughout that process, there's always a concern about aesthetics. If something looks dirty or damaged, it's going to lead to questions, and there's always a business decision that is involved throughout this process to understand when it makes more sense to decontaminate, remediate a problem, or pull up floor tiles that are damaged, or other decisions along those lines that just are more cost effective. The conclusion of the assessment and decontamination, you have your documentation where you're developing your assessment data and have clearly defined means and methods for assessment, and you're looking for the chemicals or hazards that may have been present during the operation of the facility. Obviously, it's not necessary to look for things that were never utilized on the site. So it's site-specific, and you want to be able to clearly tell the story and demonstrate that. Some clear statements about an acceptable level of risk and a certification by a qualified individual. And moving forward, we have what's in your lab. As part of that due diligence, we look for areas where information might reside, starting with initial walkthroughs and inspections and discussions, interviews with lead researchers or facility managers, reviewing your permits and licenses. That also can guide where work is going to be required. For instance, you may have biosafety level 1 and biosafety level 2 labs that may have specific decommissioning requirements versus chemical use areas, or within the lab, localized areas of radioactive material use. All of them have different obligations and requirements. Pulling together your chemical inventory and having that available, making sure you have knowledgeable people reviewing that and looking for particular chemicals that have hazards that are unique or unusual or are very persistent or present the most concern as far as decommissioning your facility. Landlord and tenant records, whether they're waste manifests from former activities, incident reports, spill reports, so anything that is internal to the organization that may provide some assistance for decommissioners. And of course, waste management, documenting where your waste is held and making sure those areas are adequately characterized. So within your space, you have surfaces and areas which require attention. Generally desktops, drawers, cabinets, shelves, horizontal surfaces throughout your space, which would require some level of knowledge of what residuals may reside there as part of the decommissioning. The same vein, you have floors, walls. How high up on the wall requires decontamination, if it at all, and that can vary depending upon the processes and materials used in particular spaces. Chemical storage areas are obviously an area of potential high risk, particularly waste storage areas. Incidences associated with spills or historic incidences of fires or something unusual, areas where particular attention may be required to assess and determine that there's no residuals are always potentially lurking. Cold rooms, animal care areas. Many times the animal facilities, vivariums, have particular concerns with air handling and ventilation, sometimes requiring detailed inspections and understanding of local exhaust and HVAC systems, sometimes decontamination by gassing. Radioactive material handling and use areas. Again, there's quite a bit of lead time and a process which requires a high level of expertise to assess and certify clean in those areas and process the licensing. Biosafety labs have particular concerns with the biologicals used in those areas. Many times your facility personnel are able to provide a lot of assistance with the procedures and management of those materials in those areas and surfaces on those areas, able to provide work procedures they utilize to decontaminate those areas as part of their routine operations. Of concern is waste handling as far as plumbing and wastewater systems. There's always that concern that something is in a P-trap or resides in piping, and to be able to definitively state that it's been assessed appropriately and found to be clean or sufficiently decontaminated. Similar to fume hoods themselves and the ductwork which conducts the air out of that area, to understand those systems and be able to adequately characterize it. There's many pieces of laboratory equipment, primarily BSCs, are something that involves particular management, whether they're being removed from the space or if they're going to remain behind. Things to consider are prepare yourself in the event of remediation. How is that going to affect your schedule? What's the likelihood of remediation being necessary? Start to think about your organization and your past history in that space. Did you have researchers that routinely had issues or spills, or do you have concerns with how your processes were being conducted, or there was a predecessor who had a lot of data gaps? Many times There's particular materials that have special concerns, mercury and various metals, azides, radioactive materials, HF, perchlorates, high and low pH, potent compounds. All these present particular hazards and concerns. Ethylene dibromide is another material that has a particular assessment and decontamination procedure to identify where residuals may have become deposited. You have to make sure, if decontamination is necessary, that the procedures are clear and appropriate for those materials. Are you dealing with just an organization or a vendor that's going to wash it down and call it clean, or is there more to it? Many times you want to ask for an SOP for managing, for instance, a mercury spill or mercury contamination if that's encountered. You want to make sure that what they're doing is appropriate. Many times there's discovery of hidden chemicals. People or researchers oftentimes have stored it away just for a rainy day and feel that they need to be able to manage these things independent, and it's dropped out of inventories, and many times it leads to issues with managing those materials and additional lab packs and costs associated with disposal. You want to have good security measures in place as you're decommissioning the areas. You don't want people and subcontractors moving through in and out of spaces when decommissioning work occurs, or at the conclusion of work entering the space and creating issues or creating aesthetically dirty surfaces. It creates issues with things not looking as clean as they should be. It could be as simple as someone removing a shelf above a lab bench and creating dust, or someone painting and sanding a hole and again creating dust. A pile of white dust or white material which is innocuous can quickly become an issue when seen through the eyes of another consultant, another person making an inspection on behalf of the landlord. Clearly mark rooms and equipment that have been decontaminated so people know that they shouldn't be storing or dumping chemicals or materials down those drains, or storing them in cleaned areas. Many times equipments can be tagged, and those tags sometimes have sign-offs by EH&S people and have directions on where they're going to be moved to and appropriate handling procedures. Lab ventilation, either local exhaust or fume hoods, also present unique challenges to decontamination. Could be as simple as a wash down is required internally, or it may involve the removal of contaminated ductwork. Does it involve a short length up to flow valves, or is it going to entail the entire system up to the roof? BSCs may require certification of clean, whether that's being removed from the property or left behind. Those certifications should be made available and those units posted. Sink traps, wastewater systems, these are the end of your process. You want to be able to look at the contents of those P-traps on sinks when possible, or remove that concern altogether by cutting and removing the P-traps and disposing of it appropriately. Wastewater systems need to be managed. Obviously, at the end of your decommissioning activities, this is one of the last steps to be dealt with. You want to be able to discharge wastewater up to the end, so your decommissioning isn't going to be generating large volumes of waste that require management. And finally, your decontamination waste pickup. That material needs to be managed appropriately. You don't want to be in the position where you've terminated your hazardous waste manifest tracking number and generating waste from a site inappropriately, or conversely, understanding the volume and mass of the material that's being generated as part of this process. You have some obligations under your generator status to be monitoring and careful of those volumes. The conclusion, you have an assessment and reporting obligation. The assessment is typically a visual inspection by someone knowledgeable and trained, including photographic documentation. You want to have before and after pictures showing conditions pre and post. Obviously, well, you want to be looking at areas of damage, wear and tear, scratches, scuffs, dents, damaged materials, confirming that they've been decontaminated but will remain behind as damaged materials. Sometimes, again, those repairs to those materials are ultimately the easiest way to avoid discussions with landlords or property managers and moving through that termination and lease obligation requirement. You want to have a clear statement on your protocols for assessing and demonstrating clean conditions. You want to include all appropriate documents associated with that, tables of data, chains of custody, whatever's been conducted on site to assess. You want to be able to clearly state and demonstrate what was done and where that work was done, essentially able to have that information independently reproduced if necessary. All your waste disposal documents showing appropriate management of materials and that there's nothing that has gone off site or remains on site that wasn't managed appropriately. Throughout the document, you have a continual process where you're reviewing what was anticipated, your plan requirements, and looking at deviations from the anticipated scope, and looking at quality assurance, quality control parameters, making sure your data that's being generated is appropriate and sufficient. Ultimately, the conclusion of the document is a statement or certification of the acceptable level of risk, and that information is being signed off upon by a qualified individual that's from the ANSI standard. Typically, that qualified individual is a certified industrial hygienist. Their involvement in the initial due diligence phase and throughout the remediation and assessment activities is important to make sure you're able to meet that lease obligation at the conclusion of your work. Again, that a thoughtful and mindful decommissioning can manage these decommissioning liabilities and lead to an easier, cost-effective decommissioning and management of those spaces. Start with the end in mind, understanding that throughout the process, things are likely to arise that will require management, whether it's chemicals that are discovered, contamination that's been discovered that requires remediation. So you don't want to be piling up your schedule to the last day of your occupancy and and discovering issues at the last minute, and sometimes the people that are required to remediate those issues or deal with those issues may not be available, and could lead to a lot of problems and a lot of costs and a lot of headaches. And upfront, defining those lease and decommission obligations helps to provide the jumping off point for your decommissioning. That can be as variables from room swept, and that's how it's going to be returned. Some organizations who don't have a lot of obligations or don't have a good awareness of health and safety or liability may opt for that scenario. Many times it's a blend of certified industrial hygienists and best management practices in the industry. Looking at your license and equipment management, again, that's a good jumping off point for determining what subcontractors are necessary, what materials and equipment need to be managed, and starts that process of aligning your equipment management, materials management, space management with your obligations of removing that from the space and making sure you have clean areas. Questions? I'll open it up to any questions anybody may have regarding decommissioning.
All right, great. So like I said before, if you have a question, just type it into your questions pane, and I'd be happy to answer them. First question coming in, someone wants to know how long a decommissioning should take.
Obviously, that can vary from a one-room area. It could be a matter of several days to likely no more than a week, week and a half. It could, on a multi-building facility, it may take several months. Generally, you'd like to start planning at least no less than 45 to 90 days prior to. That's putting things in a bit of a crunch to make sure people and vendors are available to provide quotes and execute the work in a timely fashion, and give yourself some breathing room to manage the logistics. Many times these processes start maybe a year prior to moves or decommissionings of space.
Great, thanks. Someone's asking about an estimated average cost. That's something that we'll send privately, correct?
Yeah. The costs are generally site-specific. Are you dealing with 1,000 feet or 10,000 feet? What are the materials being used? Do you have materials that require disposal as part of it? Are there specific means and methods that are required for decontamination? And again, what are your lease obligations? Is it essentially a brief letter, or do you require a decommissioning plan to be reviewed prior and a decommissioning report at the conclusion?
All right, great, thank you. Next question, I can actually field this. Someone wants to know if there's a checklist that might help us through the process. We do have a checklist on lab decontamination, not lab decommissioning. If that would be helpful, I can definitely send it out to everybody at the end of the webinar. The next question, what is needed to decon a lab to be changed to a food lab?
Right. Again, it depends upon the work that was being conducted there prior. That future intended use is always a concern. If it's, for instance, if you had large quantities of metals being managed either as pigments or dyes or as part of research, and you're changing that use to food for food production or food research, you'd have quite a bit of concern about making sure your surfaces and systems are adequately clean. And that would likely involve, a scenario in that sense would likely involve some laboratory analytical of wipe samples from surfaces for particular targeted contaminants of concern. If you had a very stringent procedure prior where you were handling materials in a clean and known fashion, you may not have such a concern with a shift to food management. So that the level of effort could vary between that previous use and that intended use. That same scenario applies. Do you know if your lab space is going to continue to be used as lab space, or is it going to be converted into child care or health care, where you would have particularly sensitive populations occupying that space? That may raise a concern. While if you know it's going to be demolished and raised as part of new construction activities, the level of effort may not be as great.
All right, thank you. Next question is, what is the best lease language to have for decommissioning? Is the correct requirement to have the decommissioning certified by a practicing industrial hygienist, or what other language do you recommend?
That lease language has changed dramatically over the past 3 to 5 years, and many times old leases have unsophisticated language. Current leases typically are looking at a performance standard associated with the ANSI standard as it presents a process, but it doesn't necessarily indicate the actual number that needs to be achieved for any particular material. Obviously, a certification by a certified industrial hygienist who's knowledgeable and active is important for these documents. I would consider language. I'm not an attorney, but I have looked at quite a few of the lease obligations, and a performance standard that's not overly specific, but talks about performance standards and certification by professionals is important. And you don't want to have a lease that's boxing you in too much and limiting the activities or being too prescriptive.
All right, next question. What cleaning methods do you use to wipe down a chem lab versus a bio lab versus a mixed use space?
Some of that, generally we're using industrial detergents for chemical decontamination, DZ7 or just industrial degreasers. It depends upon the materials used, and it's always identified specifically to materials used. Are you using an appropriate disinfectant for biological use areas, which is going to be sufficient to essentially kill the biologics that were may be present? So that varies. You would obviously want to make sure and verify that the cleaning method is appropriate for each area where it's going to be used. Many times there's metal decontamination also that would require the use of a specific process, or it could involve mercury decontamination or other more esoteric materials that have specific procedures that are required. And that's where you have to really engage with your specific scenario and someone who is knowledgeable on those issues.
Great. Next question is about Triumvirate Services. They want to know if clients need to employ their own CIH, or does Triumvirate provide CIH service for decom?
At Triumvirate, we do have a certified industrial hygienist. He carries the certification and has an obligation to maintain that license, and we do provide that service here at Triumvirate. We do also perform the decontamination as part of larger decommissioning projects where other certified industrial hygienists or other organizations are engaged to verify and assess conditions.
Great. All right. I might butcher this next question. What do you suggest to decon an area used for ETBR? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
We've encountered that residual material, residual ethylene dibromide, and what we have is I'm trying to recall the specifics which we utilized. If it's not extensive and it's light, and depending upon the surface, how porous it is, even a simple wash can be sufficient as long as you don't have a lot of permeation and penetration into the substrate. We have had extensive areas where we have encountered the contamination, and I don't recall offhand, but I can, if you can provide your email, we can get you that particular cleaner that we utilize. Again, that would be one of those areas where you would want to be able to define what those chemicals or what the particular concerns are at your facility, and be able to make sure you're utilizing the appropriate means and methods.
Great. So we have 2 more questions in the queue, but we have a little bit more time. So if anybody else has a question that they want answered, feel free to type it in. We'll definitely have time to answer it. And if we don't, I will send out an email with the answer after the presentation. So keep those questions coming. The next question is, to make a lab inactive, is any documentation needed?
To my knowledge, there's no particular document that's required. For your facility and for allowing unrestricted use in that space, it's probably a good idea to understand and document what conditions are. For instance, if you're closing it and locking the doors and not allowing people into that space, it could sit dormant. If it's going to be utilized for office space, or contractors or workers are going to enter that space to perform other activities, it's probably a good idea to understand what the conditions are in that laboratory space. If it's going to be reused for similar lab space, it's essentially a transition. What's the next intended use of the lab, I guess, is part of the question that would need to be answered to guide you.
Great. Last question, unless we have other people. Oh, we just got another one. So someone wants to know, when providing a space closure and report, can you give examples of people who might be considered a qualified individual?
Qualified, generally it's a certified industrial hygienist, sometimes a professional engineer, or other times it may be someone who has a particular expertise. For instance, an RSO in dealing with radioactive material management, or other professionals specific to materials being used or processes that are being conducted. Other times, it may be a particular individual who has knowledge about, for instance, a potent compound, or it might be an internal resource that from a particular researcher who has knowledge for a particular piece of equipment or a particular space. It varies, but generally the backstop is a certified industrial hygienist. And many times that certified industrial hygienist will rely upon other professionals to provide guidance for particular materials.
All right, thank you. Next question is, what is needed to document a lab decommissioning after a lab is closed due to acts of nature, example, hurricanes?
If chemicals have been spilled to the environment through a catastrophic event, there could be release reporting to regulatory agencies that may be required. Flooding, for instance, if you have chemicals that have washed out of the facility or the facility is completely flattened. It just depends on how much material may have been stored, what was being stored. Generally, the driver would be what kind of liability may have been triggered, and it may be either it's analogous to a phase one for property transfer to look at the environment in the surrounding area, or if it was, for instance, a flooding event, you may need to establish what contaminant residuals may have been present on interior surfaces and assess for those particular materials on surfaces. So it would be, I would say at a minimum, you would want to understand the contaminants, assess for them, and document their absence on surfaces.
Okay. Next question, and I think it's our last question unless anybody else has something they want to know, is how do you clean a fume hood?
A fume hood, primarily you're looking at what materials were handled within the fume hood. Hopefully there's a reasonable understanding what was being conducted, what research and what materials were being handled in a fume hood. For instance, if you have organic solvents, the expectation would be that there isn't a high probability that you'd have contaminants present. If you're managing metal powders, chromium pigments, or cadmium, or metals of that nature, you may be conducting wipe samples and laboratory analysis, looking for those particular materials and understanding if the residuals are present. In our experience, we've seen generally pH high or low, or presence of oxidizers is generally limited to the throat nearest the top of the fume hood, essentially. And when it is detected in that area, that's generally the worst case area. And when you assess further downstream of the fume hood, usually after elbows or the Phoenix valve, the contamination quickly diminishes. But we have had systems where it was throughout the ductwork. Contamination was throughout the ductwork and into the fan housing, and also resulted in contamination of HVAC systems. Again, it's specific to your organization and facility, and hopefully you have a well-designed and thoughtful engineering controls that can manage these materials appropriately. So
Great.
that's it. Unfortunately, it depends on what was being conducted in the particular fume hood.
Great. Awesome. So I think that's it for questions. So I think we're going to conclude our webinar right now. Thank you guys for all the questions. We will send you an email with a copy of the presentation along with a recording later today. The email will also have a link to a survey asking you to rate this webinar. If you could fill it out, that would be very helpful so we could work to improve future webinars. We have several upcoming webinars, including one on best preventative maintenance practices and one on lab moves. You can find these webinars on our events page, which is linked to in the slide you guys can see right now. It's www.triumvirate.com/training/events. We'll be sending out a gift to all the attendees as well to help you get started with your lab decommissioning project, so you can expect that. Thanks again for attending. I will send that checklist out as well to everybody. Everyone seems pretty interested in that. Thanks again for attending, and I hope to see you next time. Bye, guys.